On Christmas Day, my daughter screamed at me, "You're not family, get out!" right in front of the grandson I adore. It was all because I had stood up to protect him from her rage. But that one sentence helped me realize a much more bitter truth. Hello, friends. My name is Jacob. Thank you for being here with me. It's a pretty cold day out here in Ohio, and I'm sitting in my garage. It feels like the only place left where I can still hear myself think. I see some of you are tuning in from Texas, a few from Florida. It's good to have you here. Go ahead and hit that like button if you're ready to hear my story. It's a story about a Christmas that changed everything. It started with a bicycle. I'd spent the better part of a month on that vintage bike, a Murray, from back in the 60s sometime. I found it at a swap meet, huddled in a corner, looking forgotten and covered in a fine layer of rust that told a story of its own. Here, in my garage, surrounded by the familiar comfort of my craftsman tools hanging neatly on the pegboard, I took it apart piece by piece, down to the last nut and bolt. There's a kind of therapy in that, you know? The world outside gets complicated, but in here, things make sense. A rusted bolt needs penetrating oil and patience. A bent fender needs a gentle hand with a ball-peen hammer. I spent evenings scrubbing away the neglect, feeling the rough texture of the rust give way to the honest, smooth steel beneath. I straightened that fender, tapping it slowly, listening to the metallic ring until it was true again. I repainted it in a candy apple red, just like the original. Every night, I'd do a little more. The smell in here, it was a mix of Pennzoil and fresh paint, a smell that, for me, is the smell of purpose. It took me back to being a young man, a time when things were built to last, when you could feel the quality of something just by holding it in your hands. All that time, I pictured the face of my grandson, Leo. He's 7. I imagined his eyes when he'd see it. This wasn't just a toy I was building. It was a piece of heritage. It was a story on 2 wheels, a story about taking something broken and making it whole again. That's a lesson I wanted to pass down, a lesson that felt more important than anything you could buy in a box. Christmas morning, I carried it into the house and set it carefully under the tree. In the warm glow of the lights, the new paint gleamed. It stood out amongst the pile of brightly wrapped boxes, looking proud and solid. When Leo came downstairs, he saw it right away. His eyes, they just lit up. It was everything I had hoped for. He walked right past all the other gifts and ran a small hand over the chrome, touching the little brass bell I'd spent 2 hours polishing. But then Clara, my daughter, walked in. She didn't even really look at the bike. Her eyes just scanned over it, a quick, dismissive glance. She pulled Leo away, steering him towards a massive box in the corner. "Mommy has something much better for you, sweetie," she said, and then her husband, Derek, pulled out a plastic electric quad bike. You know the kind. Mass-produced, covered in stickers, the sort of thing that'll be in a landfill in 3 years. Clara looked at me then. It was a look I'll never forget, a mix of pity and annoyance. "Dad," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "it's dirty, and it has sharp edges. It's dangerous." She talked about the hours of my life, the care I'd poured into that bike, as if it were a piece of junk I'd dragged in from the curb. The word dirty hung in the air. She made my gift, my story, sound like a threat. Later that afternoon, the engine on Derek's brand new German SUV wouldn't turn over. It just made that dead clicking sound. Click, click, click. I stepped out into the biting December air. The cold hit my face, sharp and clean. I didn't need a computer to tell me what was wrong. I just needed my ears. I've been listening to engines my whole life. "Sounds like the starter relay," I said, pulling my collar up, "or you've just got some corrosion on the battery terminals." Derek didn't even look up from his phone. He let out a little chuckle, a smirk that I'd come to know all too well. "Come on, Jacob," he said. It's a new German car. You have to plug a computer into it. Your time has passed. He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather. Your time has passed. With those 4 words, 40 years of my experience, of getting my hands greasy, of understanding how things work, it was all wiped away. My greatest strength, the knowledge I had built over a lifetime, was turned into a weakness, a sign of being obsolete. I just stood there, the cold wind feeling a little colder than before. I tried to salvage the evening. I really did. Later, as we were all sitting by the fire, I tried to connect. I started telling a story I was proud of about the time I restored a '67 Mustang for a client. I remembered every detail, the challenge of finding original parts, the satisfaction of hearing that engine roar to life for the first time in 20 years. It was more than just a job. It was like bringing something back from the dead. In the middle of my story, I glanced over at Clara. She was staring down at her phone, her thumbs swiping endlessly, her face illuminated by that cold blue light. She was in another world. When I finished my story, the last words just sort of hung in the silence of the room. She looked up, her eyes unfocused for a second, as if just realizing I'd been speaking. "Yeah, that's nice, Dad," she said, her voice flat. "Do you want some more coffee?" An entire chapter of my life, a legacy of skill and passion I held so dear, was dismissed with a lifeless question about coffee. I just sat there, holding the mug in my hands, feeling the coffee go cold. I watched Clara and Derek whispering to each other, their heads bent together over their phones. They were in their own world, a fast-moving digital world where I didn't have a place. Every attempt I made to build a bridge was like throwing a stone against a glass wall. I started to feel my own presence fading in that room. I wasn't a father or a grandfather. I was becoming a piece of old furniture, something that's been there so long no one really sees it anymore. And that feeling of being ignored right to your face, it hurts more than an angry word ever could. What made it worse was the whisper. I caught a fragment of it. Derek, leaning towards Clara, said, "Have to keep an eye on the phone. That partner is about to call." And as he said it, he flicked a quick glance in my direction. I didn't understand it then. Not fully. But looking back, I realized what it was. They were performing. They were deliberately highlighting their busyness, their modern lives, to emphasize my idleness, my irrelevance. It was a subtle kind of isolation, a way to make me feel not just different, but like I was an obstacle, a slow-moving thing in their fast-paced world. All I could do was sit there in silence and take a sip of my cold, bitter coffee. Despite everything, Leo loved the bicycle. He was afraid to ride it in the living room because of his mother, so he just walked it around and around on the rug, his small hand possessively on the handlebar, ringing the little brass bell every so often. Ting, ting. I sat and watched him, and for a moment, just a single quiet moment, I felt like all the work had been worth it. His smile was all I needed. I thought, maybe this is enough. Maybe I just need to learn to accept that I'm an outsider in my own daughter's world now. It was a sad thought, a heavy one, but it felt like the truth. But then it happened. In his excitement, Leo pushed the bike a little too hard. The metal kickstand, the one I had so carefully cleaned and oiled, dragged for a foot or so across Clara's polished hardwood floor. It left a faint, thin scratch, the kind you'd only see if the light hit it just right. But to Clara, you would have thought he'd taken an axe to it. She stormed out of the kitchen, her face flushed with anger. "Leo, what are you doing?" she yelled, her voice sharp and shrill. Leo flinched and let go of the bike as if it were red hot. She didn't stop. She kept shouting at him about how careless he was, about how he never listened. I couldn't just sit there. "Clara, that's enough," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. It's just a scratch. I can fix it." I shouldn't have said that. In an instant, her rage pivoted from him to me. "You can fix it? This is your fault. You're the one who brought that thing into my house. You spoil him. You always have." She spoke as if I were a vandal, as if I had come into her perfect home with the sole intention of ruining it. Derek just sat on the couch, arms crossed, with a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He was enjoying it. After Clara had dragged a crying Leo to his room, Derek started in. His voice was soft, calculated. "You see, Jacob," he began, "maybe Clara has a point. That stuff in your garage, all those tools, it's a hazard." He started talking about my garage, my sanctuary. He said it was cluttered and a fire risk. He said I should be taking it easy, and that the best way to do that would be to sell it all off, to clear out the space. He was attacking the last place on earth that was truly mine. He wanted to take away the one thing that still made me feel useful, that still made me feel like myself. He wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, caring tone that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "And besides," he said, "you're getting older, Dad. All these bills, the paperwork, it's all so complicated now. Why don't you just sign a power of attorney over to us? We can handle everything for you. It would be so much easier. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." The words sounded like concern, but I could feel the cold calculation behind them. They didn't just want my space. They wanted my finances. They wanted my independence. They wanted to strip away my autonomy until I was a child again, completely and utterly dependent on them. I didn't answer him right away. I just looked at him, right into his eyes, and I saw the greed there. It was plain as day. I took a deep breath, a slow one, and I could smell the pine from the Christmas tree. I held his gaze. "I'll have to think about that," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "That's not something you rush into." It was the first time in a long time that I hadn't just gone along with them. It was a small act of defiance, just a handful of words, but it was enough to make the air in the room go tight and cold. Clara shot Derek a look, a flash of annoyance. I knew, right then and there, that I had just stepped into a fight I never wanted. But I also knew I had no choice. My answer seemed to pour gasoline on a fire I didn't even see burning. Clara's face, which had been tight with anger, twisted into something else. Contempt. "Think?" she scoffed, the word sharp and ugly in the festive room. "What is there to think about? We are trying to help you. For once in your life, can't you stop thinking only about yourself?" "Help?" The word came out of me louder than I intended. The quiet calm I'd been holding on to for the entire day finally fractured. "Is that what you call this? Helping? By calling my gift junk? By telling me my life's experience is useless? By trying to convince me to sell off my entire life? Everything that makes me who I am? That's not help, Clara. That's an insult." The argument escalated, but not with shouting. It was worse than shouting. It was the quiet, vicious kind of fighting, where every word is chosen to cut as deep as possible. It was a series of low, sharp jabs, each one aimed at a place we both knew was vulnerable. I spoke of the value of hard work. She called it being stuck in the past. I spoke of wanting to leave a legacy for Leo. She called it forcing my outdated hobbies on a child. And then it happened. In the heat of it, when I finally said that all I ever wanted was a little respect in my own daughter's home, she broke. Her face contorted, and she finally yelled. It wasn't a reasoned argument anymore. It was pure, unfiltered rage, and she unleashed the words that I know will echo in my mind until the day I die. Respect? She shrieked. You come in here and judge everything we do. You're not family. You're a burden. Get out! The whole world just stopped. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The happy, crackling fire fell silent. Leo was standing in the doorway of his room, his eyes wide, his small body trembling. He had heard it all, the word burden. For a man of my generation, a man who has spent his entire life providing, standing on his own 2 feet, that word is a poison dart. It hits the deepest fear we have, the fear of being useless, of being a weight on the people we are supposed to support. But the other part, you're not family. That was worse, so much worse. It didn't just hurt, it erased. It took 60+ years of being a father, of birthdays and scraped knees, of teaching her to ride a bike and drive a car, of walking her down the aisle. And it wiped the slate clean. In 10 seconds, she had undone a lifetime. Silence. A thick, heavy silence fell over the room. I looked at Clara, then at Derek. I searched their faces for some flicker of regret, some sign that she had gone too far. I saw none. What I saw was irritation, annoyance that the mask had slipped, that they had accidentally revealed the ugly truth of what they really thought. Slowly, I pushed myself up from the armchair. My knees felt weak, unsteady. I didn't say another word. There was nothing left to say. I walked past Leo, my hand hovering over his head for a moment before I gently rested it on his hair. He flinched, still terrified. Then I walked to the front door and pulled my old Carhartt jacket from the hook. The moment I opened the door, a wave of frigid Ohio air rushed in, but I barely felt it. My body was numb, disconnected. I was just a machine going through the motions. Put on jacket, step outside, pull the door closed. Click. The sound of the latch catching was so final. It was the sound of an ending. I got in my truck and just drove. I had no destination. The Christmas lights on the houses blurred into long, meaningless streaks of color. They looked alien, like decorations from a world I no longer belonged to. I drove through familiar streets, past the park where I taught Clara to throw a baseball, past the high school she graduated from, but I didn't recognize any of it. My mind was a hollow cavern, and the only thing inside was the echo of her voice. You're a burden. Get out. Over and over again, every word a shard of broken glass grinding away inside my head. What did I do wrong? Was this the result of a life spent working, providing, trying to build a family, to be thrown out of your own child's home on Christmas Day? The emptiness was absolute. I wasn't a father anymore. I wasn't a grandfather. I was just an old man in a pickup truck, driving aimlessly into the cold, dark night. Later that evening, I was sitting alone in my own kitchen. The house was cold and silent. I picked up my old smartphone. Frank, a buddy from the auto shop, had tagged me in a post about a classic Ford Falcon, and that's when I saw it. A new post from Clara. It was a family picture taken that afternoon in front of the Christmas tree. There they were, Clara, Derek, and Leo, all smiling, beaming into the camera. I remembered the moment that photo was taken. I had been sitting in the armchair right next to Leo, but in this version, the version she posted for the world to see, I was gone, cropped out, erased completely, as if I had never been there at all. The caption under the photo read, "My perfect little family." And that's when I finally understood. What she had screamed at me earlier, it wasn't just a moment of anger, it was a declaration. It was the truth. Looking at that picture, at the empty space where I was supposed to be, the searing pain in my chest began to change. It cooled, hardened into something else. A cold, clear certainty. I wasn't just sad anymore. I felt a slow burning anger begin to smolder deep inside me. They didn't just throw me out, they were trying to delete me. to act as if I never existed. I switched off the phone and set it down on the table. I walked over to the kitchen sink, turned on the tap, and began to wash my hands. I scrubbed them with soap, methodically, under the cold running water, as if I could wash away the filth of the humiliation. I looked up and saw my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I saw the face of a tired old man, etched with the lines of grief and shock. But for the first time that day, I saw something else too. A flicker of light coming back into his eyes, a spark of defiance. They would not erase me. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was unnervingly quiet. On any other year, the day after Christmas would be filled with the sound of Leo playing with new toys and the smell of Martha, my late wife, baking cinnamon rolls. But now, there was only a profound silence and the kind of cold that seems to seep in right through the walls. I didn't make coffee. I just pulled on my old Carhartt jacket, the one that still carries the faint smell of motor oil and sawdust, and walked straight out to the garage. It was the only room in the house where I didn't feel like a ghost. The cold shock of the metal doorknob in my palm felt good. It felt real. It woke me up. Inside, under the steady hum of the single fluorescent light, I looked down at my hands. These are not the hands of a man who sits still. They're calloused and scarred, with dirt permanently etched into the lines of my knuckles. These hands didn't just fix cars. They built this house. They worked double shifts at the plant during the oil crisis back in the 70s to make sure there was always food on the table. I remember that time so clearly. The long lines of cars snaking around the block waiting for gas, the worry on everyone's faces. Back then, you didn't throw things away. You couldn't afford to. People would bring their old, beaten-up cars to me, cars that by today's standards would be scrap metal. And they'd beg me to keep them running for one more month, one more week, just so they could get to work. It was in those lean, hard years that I learned the true meaning of self-reliance. You saved every penny. You fixed what was broken. You built your life with the tools you had in your own two hands. I started to clean. Not because the garage was messy, it never is, but because I needed to create order out of the chaos that was churning inside me. I took a clean rag from a hook and began to wipe down my tools one by one. I started with the wrenches, feeling the familiar heft of each one in my hand. These were the tools that got Martha and me through stagflation. They were the tools that paid for Clara's college education. The slow, methodical motion began to calm my mind. Wipe down a socket wrench, put it back in its designated spot. Wipe down a screwdriver, hang it back on the pegboard. Each tool I cleaned was a tangled thought I was straightening out. The hurt was still there, a deep, heavy ache in my chest. But it wasn't hot anymore. It was changing, cooling, hardening into something else, something stronger, like steel. As I was organizing a drawer of odds and ends, my fingers brushed against a faded photograph. It was Martha. She was standing next to me in this very garage, smiling, with a smudge of grease on her cheek. We'd just finished getting the old John Deere lawn tractor running again. She was the one who sat with me at the kitchen table, poring over bills and receipts. She was the one who always believed we could weather any storm as long as we had each other. I held the photo and looked at her smiling face. I spoke to her, not out loud, but in the quiet of my own heart. "I'm sorry, Martha," I thought. I let things get away from me. I let them disrespect everything we worked so hard to build. In that moment, looking at her, I knew I couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about my hurt feelings anymore. This was about defending our life, our legacy. This was for her, too. This garage, it's my sanctuary. I believe every man has a place like this. Maybe it's a workshop, a fishing boat, or just a favorite armchair in the den. It's that one spot where you can hear yourself think, where you can put the world back in order. Do you have a place like that? I'd be interested to hear about your sanctuary in the comments below. After I'd put the last tool away, I sat down at my old wooden workbench. I pulled out a clean, spiral-bound notebook and a pen. It was the same kind of notebook I used to jot down engine specs or wiring diagrams. But today, I turned to a fresh page, and I began to write. It wasn't a plan for revenge. It was a list. I wrote down the words Clara had said. "It's dirty." I wrote down Derek's smirk. "Your time is past." I wrote down the dismissive question about coffee. I wrote down the lie about the power of attorney. "You're a burden." I wrote about the cropped photograph, detail after detail. The only sound in the entire garage was the soft scratching of the pen on the paper. For me, it sounded like the first shot being fired in a long, quiet struggle, a struggle to reclaim my own dignity. When I finished writing, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of grief and confusion had lifted. I knew I couldn't do this alone. But before I reached out for professional help, I needed to talk to someone I could trust completely. Someone who understood my world, who valued loyalty and discretion above all else. I closed the notebook and tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I knew exactly who I had to call. Frank. He'd lived through the same hard times. He'd understand. One phone call. That would be the first step. I didn't call Frank right away. I held on to that decision through the long, quiet night, letting it settle in my bones. A man of my generation, you see, we don't air our family's dirty laundry. It's not how we were raised. You handle your problems yourself, you keep your head down, and you carry your own weight. Making that call felt like admitting I couldn't carry mine anymore. But as the sun came up, casting a pale gray light into my cold kitchen, I knew I had no other choice. This was bigger than pride. I waited until exactly 7 o'clock the next morning. It's the time we'd usually call each other if a job came up, or if one of us needed a hand with something heavy. My thumb hovered over his name on the screen. There was a moment of hesitation, a final bastion of that old-world stoicism telling me to hang up. I pushed past it and pressed the button. When Frank picked up, his voice was thick with sleep, just as I knew it would be. "Jacob?" he grumbled. Hearing that familiar, gruff voice was like finding a landmark in a storm. I knew I'd done the right thing. "It's me, Frank," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. "You got time for a cup of coffee?" "At the usual spot." There was no hesitation on his end, no questions, no, "Is everything all right?" He knew my voice. He knew if I was calling at this hour for coffee, it wasn't just for coffee. "Give me 30 minutes, was all he said before hanging up. That's the thing I've always valued about Frank. A man of few words, but those words are as solid as the steel we used to work with. He's always been reliable. The diner hasn't changed in 30 years. Walking in felt like stepping back in time. It still has the same red vinyl booths with the cracks taped over. The same long Formica countertop worn smooth by decades of elbows. And that same comforting smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee that sticks to your clothes for hours. It was our place. A safe harbor. Frank was already there, perched on a stool at the counter, his coffee cup already half empty. He saw me walk in and just gave me a short, simple nod as I slid onto the stool next to him. A moment later, a heavy ceramic mug appeared in front of me. The waitress, a woman who's probably been working there as long as we've been coming, put it down without a word. She knew my order. We sat there for a few minutes in a comfortable silence, just letting the familiar sounds of the diner wash over us, the clatter of plates from the kitchen, the low murmur of conversation from the booths. Frank let me have that silence. He let me be the one to start. He knew that whatever I had to say, I needed to say it on my own time. And so, I told him. Staring down into the black coffee, I told him everything. I laid it all out piece by piece, like I was disassembling a faulty engine to find the source of the problem. I told him about the bicycle, about the pride I'd felt, and the sting of Clara's words. I told him about Derek's smirk, about the comment, "Your time is past." I told him about the argument, about the terrible final words she had screamed at me, and about being cropped out of that family photograph on Facebook. I didn't get emotional. I didn't raise my voice or let it crack. I just reported the facts, one after the other, in a low, steady tone. Frank listened. He didn't interrupt once. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on me, occasionally giving a slow nod of understanding. His big, calloused hands were wrapped around his coffee mug, his thumb rubbing back and forth over the warm ceramic. Just having someone listen, truly listen without judgment, felt like a physical weight being lifted from my shoulders. A pressure I didn't even realize I was carrying was starting to ease. When I finished, a heavy silence settled between us again. Frank didn't say anything for a long time. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. Then he finally set the mug down with a soft click and turned to face me. "These kids today, Jacob," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They live in a disposable world. They think everything can just be thrown out and replaced with a new one. Cars, phones, people." He shook his head slowly. He didn't give me advice. He didn't tell me what I should or shouldn't do. He did something much more important. He validated what I was feeling. "You're not wrong, Jacob," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "You're not the one who's out of line here. You spent your whole life giving. What you're asking for isn't money. It isn't even gratitude. It's respect, and that's the most basic thing a man can ask for." That one sentence, that's all it took. It was like a steel beam being lowered into a weak foundation. It gave me strength. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't just an old man bitter about the changing world. My anger was justified. My pain was real. I was asking for something I had earned 1,000 times over. Frank's tone then shifted, becoming practical, grounded. "So," he asked, leaning in a little closer, "what's your next move? You got anything more than just your word against theirs?" That question brought me right back down to earth. Anger is the fuel, but you can't drive without a roadmap. I told him about Derek's carefully worded suggestions, the talk of selling my tools, and the pressure to sign a power of attorney. I told him about the hushed, vague phone calls I'd overheard, talk of partners and investments that always seemed to stop the moment I walked into a room. "I think he's using my name, Frank," I said, the suspicion finally taking shape as I said it out loud. "Maybe for more than just show." Frank's brow furrowed. He stared into his coffee cup as if the answer was floating in there. "Jacob," he said finally, his voice grim, "if what you're thinking is true, this isn't a family squabble anymore. This is fraud." And so we sat there, two old mechanics in a timeless diner, and we started to map out a plan. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't elaborate. It was simple. I needed proof, hard evidence. And the most likely place to find that proof was inside the very house I'd been thrown out of, on Derek's laptop. Frank looked at me, a deep worry in his eyes. "Are you sure about this? It's a hell of a risk, Jacob." I took a final sip of my coffee and nodded, my resolve hardening. "I'm sure," I said. "I'm not going to break in. I still have a key. I just need a window. A time when I know for sure they're not home." When I walked out of that diner, the cold morning air felt different. It felt clean. I was no longer just a man lost in his own grief. I was a man with a mission, and I wasn't alone anymore. 2 days passed in almost complete silence. I didn't reach out to them, and they made no effort to contact me. The silence was its own answer. I spent those days in the garage, losing myself in the familiar process of rebuilding an old Holly carburetor just to keep my hands busy. My mind, however, was anything but quiet. Every scenario, every risk, played over and over. Then, on the third day, my phone rang. It was Frank. "Jacob," he said, his voice low but clear, getting straight to the point. "I just took a drive past your daughter's place. Looks like they're headed out of town. Suitcases in the back of the SUV. The whole family was dressed for travel." My heart gave a single, heavy thud against my ribs. This was it. The window. "Thanks, Frank," was all I said. He grunted in acknowledgement and hung up. We both knew nothing more needed to be said. I waited another hour, an agonizing hour, where every tick of the clock in my kitchen sounded like a hammer blow. I needed to be absolutely sure they were gone. Finally, I grabbed my keys and headed out. Driving over there, my hands felt slick on the steering wheel. The quiet suburban streets looked the same, but they felt different, charged with a nervous energy. Their house stood silent under the weak winter sun. It looked empty. I walked up the path, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the concrete. I pulled out my key, the key I'd had since the day they moved in, and slipped it into the lock. The familiar click of the tumblers turning echoed in the stillness. It was a sound I'd heard 1,000 times, but today it sounded like a gunshot. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the smell of home. It was some kind of artificial air freshener, a cloying floral scent that Clara must have liked. It wasn't the smell of Martha's baking that used to fill these halls. In that moment, the house I had helped pay for felt utterly alien. I felt like a trespasser. Everything was neat, tidy, and cold. It was a showroom, not a home. I didn't waste any time. I walked straight down the hall to Derek's office, a small room I had rarely ever entered. It was just like him, sleek, impersonal, and filled with expensive technology that all seemed to hum with a low, self-satisfied energy. His laptop was sitting on the desk, closed, a silver monolith. I took a deep breath, walked over, and opened it. The screen lit up, illuminating the darkened room, and presented me with a single insurmountable wall, a password prompt. My heart sank. Of course. What was I thinking? I'm a mechanic, not some kind of spy. I don't know the first thing about computers. For a moment, I just stood there defeated. Then I took another breath and tried to think. I had to think like him. What would a man like Derek, a man so consumed with his own image, use as a password? He was arrogant, self-important. I tried his name. Nothing. Clara's name. Nothing. Their anniversary. Still nothing. And then it hit me. Leo. Derek wasn't an attentive father, but using his own son's birthday as a password? It was the perfect cover. It would make him look like a dedicated family man to anyone who might see it. A simple, sentimental choice. It was a performance, just like everything else in his life. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed in the numbers. Leo's birthday, August 14th, 0814. I hit enter. The screen unlocked. A wave of nausea and triumph washed over me. I was right. His arrogance was his weakness. He used his own son as a convenient tool, a prop for his image. My heart was hammering against my ribs now, a frantic drumbeat in the silent house. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and shallow. I started clicking, searching. The files were all meticulously organized with corporate-sounding names, business projections, partner outreach, financials Q4. I opened one after another, confronted with a dizzying array of spreadsheets, charts, and business jargon that meant nothing to me. A knot of panic began to tighten in my stomach. What if I couldn't find anything? What if I was wrong? Every sound from outside, a car driving down the street, the wind rattling the window pane, made me jump. I felt like I was running out of time, and then I saw it. An email in his sent folder. The recipient was a commercial lending firm. The subject line was, Follow up on auto tech venture. There was a PDF file attached. My hand was shaking as I double-clicked it. It was a business loan application, a proposal for something he was calling an automotive technology startup. I scrolled through the pages, my eyes scanning the numbers. The loan amount was huge, staggering, and then I saw my name. It was on page 3, under the section for guarantors and key investors. Jacob Miller, it read, esteemed angel investor and retired proprietor of the successful Miller & Sons Garage, has committed his full financial assets and personal estate as collateral. My breath caught in my throat. The words swam before my eyes. He hadn't just used my name. He hadn't just exaggerated my involvement. He had forged a lie, a monstrous lie, offering up the entirety of my life's work, my home, my security, as a sacrificial lamb for his scheme. He was turning me into bait to steal other people's money. I wasn't his father-in-law. I was his collateral. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just sat there in the cold silence of his office, staring at my own name on the glowing screen. Jacob Miller. The name my father gave me, the name I'd spent a lifetime building, making it stand for something in this town. Honesty, hard work, a job done right. Now, here it was, twisted and cheapened, used as a piece of bait by my own son-in-law. The white-hot anger I expected to feel never came. Instead, a profound, chilling cold spread through my chest, solidifying into a block of ice. It was the kind of cold that clears your head completely. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This wasn't a family argument that had gotten out of hand. This was a crime. In that moment, any trace of panic or fear I'd felt vanished. My mind became strangely, wonderfully clear. My movements were deliberate, precise. I scanned the desk and saw an old USB flash drive lying next to a stack of papers. Without a second thought, I picked it up and plugged it into the side of the laptop. My hand was perfectly steady. I found the PDF file, the entire email chain connected to it, and a few other suspicious-looking financial documents, and I dragged them all onto the USB drive's icon. A small light on the drive began to blink, a tiny rhythmic pulse in the quiet room. It looked like the heartbeat of a time bomb, a bomb that was now mine. When the file transfer was complete, I ejected the drive properly, just like the instructions on the screen said to. I went into the browser history and deleted every trace of my activity. Then, I put the laptop back to sleep, closing the lid with a soft click. I stood up and left the room, pulling the door gently closed behind me. My work here was done. Before I left the house, I paused at the doorway to Leo's room. I looked inside. In the corner, the big plastic electric quad bike was lying on its side, already forgotten. But over by his bed, standing upright and proud, was the red bicycle. And sitting in the little wire basket I'd attached to the handlebars was his favorite stuffed bear, tucked in and ready for a ride. Seeing that, a wave of certainty washed over me, erasing any last flicker of doubt. I was doing the right thing. Not just for me, not just for Martha's memory, I was doing it for him. That little boy deserved to grow up knowing the difference between what's real and what's a lie. He deserved a family built on a foundation of truth, not a house of cards built on deceit. I pulled the door to his room closed, turned my back on the silent house, and walked away without looking back. You know, it's a strange thing, discovering a betrayal. Sometimes the evidence of disrespect isn't in a shouting match or a slammed door. Sometimes it's just quiet words on a screen, a secret text message, or an email you were never meant to see. It's a quiet kind of devastation, isn't it? Finding out the truth about someone you trusted in such a cold, undeniable way. If you've ever felt that, you know what I'm talking about. Feel free to share, if you're comfortable. Back in the safety of my garage, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I walked over to my old desktop computer, a dinosaur by today's standards but reliable as an old Ford, and plugged in the USB drive. I opened the files again, reading every single word slowly, carefully, making sure I hadn't imagined it, that I hadn't misunderstood. But the truth was just as ugly the second time around. I copied everything into a new folder, gave it a nonsense name, and buried it deep within other system files where no one would ever stumble upon it. This little piece of plastic in my hand now held my entire future. I couldn't just leave it lying around. I walked over to a metal cabinet where I keep old parts. I found what I was looking for, a small, sturdy tin box that once held a set of vintage Champion spark plugs. I opened it, dropped the USB drive inside, and closed the lid. It felt right. Something priceless, something dangerous, hidden in plain sight amongst the ordinary. Then I picked up my phone and called Frank. "I've got it," was all I said. This time, I didn't suggest the diner. This was different. "Can you come to the garage?" I asked. When Frank arrived, I didn't waste time with small talk. I just pointed to the computer screen. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his shirt pocket, put them on, and leaned in close, his posture slowly stiffening as he read. The silence in the garage stretched on, broken only by the hum of the old machine. When he was done, he slowly straightened up and took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes. He turned and looked at me, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Jesus Christ, Jacob," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That son of a bitch!" Frank is not a man who curses. In all the years I've known him, I could count on one hand the number of times I've heard him use strong language. Hearing it from him then, in the quiet of my garage, told me that this was even worse than I had imagined. "You can't handle this yourself," he said, his voice firm now, decisive. "This isn't a family problem anymore. This is felony fraud. You need a lawyer." The word hung in the air between us. Lawyer. It made it all so real, so official. It meant taking this private pain and dragging it out into the public light. It meant declaring war. Was I scared? Hell yes, I was. But as I stood there, I weighed that fear against the alternative, the fear of living out the rest of my days as a burden, a victim, a man erased from his own life. And there was no contest. The fear of inaction was 100 times worse. "You know anyone?" I asked, my voice steady. Frank nodded, a grim look on his face. "I do," he said. "He's good. He's tough. And more importantly, he's one of us. He restores old Mustangs." The office of the lawyer, Mr. Davies, wasn't in one of those new, gleaming glass towers downtown. It was on an old street, in a solid 4-story brick building that looked like it had been there for 100 years and would be there for 100 more. Frank's comment that he was a car guy had settled something in me. I didn't want some slick young kid in a shiny suit who would look at me and see a case number. I needed someone who understood the value of things that were built to last, things that had a history. Walking inside, I felt my shoulders relax just a little. The office smelled of old books, polished wood, and the faint, pleasant scent of leather from the high-backed chairs. It reminded me of the public library when I was a kid. It felt solid, trustworthy. Mr. Davies himself was a man about my age. His hair was silver, but his eyes were sharp, and his handshake was firm and dry. There was no pretense about him. He simply gestured to a chair and said, "Coffee or water, Mr. Miller?" "Water would be fine, thank you," I said. His calm, unhurried demeanor was contagious. The frantic energy that had been buzzing under my skin since I left Clara's house began to subside. I didn't waste his time with a long, emotional story. Just like with Frank, I laid out the facts. But this time, I had more than just my word. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the small USB drive, and placed it on the wide oak desk that sat between us. It looked tiny and insignificant on the vast, polished surface. "It's all in there, sir," I said. Mr. Davies nodded slowly. He took the drive, plugged it into his computer, and put on his reading glasses. As he started to read, I watched his face. The polite professional mask he wore slowly dissolved, replaced by an expression of intense, focused concentration. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightened. He didn't say a word. He just scrolled, his eyes methodically scanning every line, absorbing every detail of the betrayal. The only sound in the room was the soft click of his mouse. When he was finished, he didn't speak for a long moment. He leaned back in his leather chair, which let out a soft groan, and steepled his fingers together, his eyes fixed on the screen. Finally, he looked at me. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice even but carrying a new weight, "what we have here goes far beyond a family disagreement. On this drive, there is clear evidence of potential wire fraud, identity theft for financial gain, and what the state defines as felony financial elder abuse. This is exceptionally serious." Hearing those cold legal terms, a strange mix of fear and relief washed over me. The shapeless, agonizing hurt that I'd been carrying inside me for days finally had a name. It had a definition. It was real. It wasn't just in my head. "So," I asked, my voice a little hoarse, "what do we do?" Davies explained the path forward with a calm clarity that I desperately needed. "The first step," he said, "wasn't to file a lawsuit. It wasn't to go to the police. The first step was to send a formal letter, a cease and desist demand. The letter would state, in no uncertain terms, that we were aware of the fraudulent activity. It would demand the immediate cessation of any use of my name, credit, or assets, and it would require them to arrange a meeting to address the situation directly." "This letter does two things, Mr. Miller," Davies said, his eyes meeting mine. "First, it puts them on notice that their game is over. Second, and more importantly, it tells them that you are no longer alone. It tells them you're ready to fight." I sat there and let his words sink in. A letter. A single official act. It was a line in the sand. A declaration of war. Once that letter was sent, there would be no going back. The fractured relationship I had with my daughter would likely shatter completely, beyond any hope of repair. But then I thought of Martha and the life we built. I thought of my garage, my sanctuary. I thought of Leo and the look on his face as he treasured that red bicycle. And I thought of my own name, my own dignity. I had already lost so much. What more was there to lose? I looked Mr. Davies straight in the eye and gave him a single, firm nod. "Do it," I said. "Send the letter." 2 days after my meeting with Mr. Davies, a copy of the letter arrived at my house. I picked it up from the mat inside the mail slot and held it in my hands. It felt heavy. The paper wasn't like normal paper. It was thick and stiff, a heavy bond stock with the law firm's letterhead elegantly embossed at the top. I read it again, standing there in my quiet hallway. The legal language was so cold, so precise and sharp, completely devoid of emotion. Whereas it said, hereinafter, cease and desist. But to me, every one of those sterile legal words was a scream that I had held back for far too long. I hadn't mailed it, of course. Mr. Davies had sent the original via certified mail, but holding this copy, I knew that a process had been set in motion and nothing would ever be the same again. I spent the rest of that day waiting. A part of me expected the phone to ring off the hook, expected Clara to call me, screaming, crying, accusing. But there was nothing. Just a deep, profound silence that was, in its own way, more unnerving than any argument. I couldn't focus on my work in the garage. I found myself pacing the length of the concrete floor, wiping down tools that were already clean, and stopping every few minutes to look out the small, grimy window toward the street. I knew they had received the letter by now. The mail would have come, and I knew they weren't just ignoring it. They were planning. They were strategizing. This was not a fight they would give up on easily. Late that afternoon, just as the street lights outside flickered on, casting a pale yellow glow onto the street, a familiar SUV pulled up to the curb in front of my house. It was Derek's. Both he and Clara got out. They hadn't called. They hadn't sent a text. They just appeared. They didn't look like they were coming for a fight. Clara was wearing a soft, expensive-looking cashmere sweater, and Derek was carrying a gift basket filled with fruit and cheeses. They looked like concerned children coming to check on their ailing, elderly father. My heart started to beat a little faster, a nervous, frantic rhythm, but I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath. Calm. I had to stay calm. I walked to the front door and opened it before they could knock, but I didn't step aside to let them in. I just stood there, filling the doorway. "Dad," Clara began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that was so fake it was almost sour. "We were so worried about you. Why would you do this? If something was wrong, you should have just talked to us. Why would you involve lawyers?" Derek chimed in, his face a perfect mask of gentle concern. "There's obviously been a terrible misunderstanding, Jacob. That email you saw was just a draft, a hypothetical. We would never, ever do something like that without your permission." They were playing their parts perfectly. They were trying to paint me as a confused old man, addled and prone to overreacting. They were trying to gaslight me into believing that the truth I had held in my hands was just a figment of my failing mind. I said nothing. I simply looked at them. I held Clara's gaze, searching for any flicker of shame or remorse in her eyes. I found none. All I saw was a cold, hard calculation. I looked at Derek, and I saw the anxiety radiating off him. Not for me, not for our family, but for his precious, fraudulent business plan that was now in jeopardy. I didn't argue. I didn't try to defend myself. What was the point? They would only twist my words, use them as more evidence of my supposed confusion. Instead, I let my silence speak for me. My silence was a wall they could not climb. My silence said, "I know what you did." It said, "The performance is over." As the seconds stretched on, I could see their composure starting to crack. Derek's practiced smile became strained at the edges. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch. Clara's expression of sweet concern began to curdle into the familiar lines of impatience and anger. "Aren't you going to say anything?" she asked, her voice losing its gentle tone, rising in pitch. "After everything we've done for you?" Still, I remained silent. I just held their gaze. Finally, when it was clear that their act had failed, that I would not be baited or manipulated, I spoke. Just one sentence, my voice low and even. "From now on," I said, looking from one to the other, "you can talk to my lawyer." And with that, I slowly, deliberately closed the door. I didn't slam it like she had done at Christmas. I closed it softly, but with a finality that was as absolute as a stone wall. For a few days, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the tense, coiled silence of a standoff. Then, I got an unusual phone call. It was from my family doctor's office. The nurse on the line was friendly, telling me it was time to book my annual physical. "I think there's a mistake," I said, looking at the calendar on my wall. "My checkup isn't until June." There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. "Oh," the nurse said, a note of hesitation in her voice. "Well, yes, that's right. But your son called us. He expressed some concern about your memory lately, and he was hoping we could see you sooner just to be safe." "My son?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I don't have a son. I have a son-in-law." Derek. A cold dread washed over me as I understood instantly what he was doing. He'd called my doctor, pretending to be my son, planting a seed of doubt, of concern. He was building a narrative. He was laying the groundwork for a medical file that would say I was confused, that I was senile, that I was no longer competent to make my own decisions. This was a far more vicious attack than stealing money or forging a signature. He was trying to steal my mind. He was trying to steal my very self. It didn't stop there. The poison began to seep into other parts of my life. A neighbor I barely spoke to suddenly offered to mow my lawn, mentioning that, "At your age, you have to be careful." A distant cousin called out of the blue, asking if I was eating properly, saying she'd heard I'd been a bit forgetful lately. It was a campaign, a quiet, insidious whisper campaign. Derek and Clara were calling everyone they could think of, weaving a story of my decline. They were trying to isolate me, to discredit me, to turn me into a pitiful, unreliable old man in the eyes of the world before I ever had a chance to tell my side of the story. And for the first time since that Christmas night, I felt a genuine, terrifying wave of fear. I started to second-guess myself. Was my memory getting worse? Had I imagined the tone in Derek's voice? Was it possible I had misunderstood the email? I walked out into the garage and ran my hand over the cool, solid steel of my workbench. It was real. I went back inside and read the copy of the loan application on my computer. The words were still there, unchanged. But their strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. The greatest fear of a man getting older isn't death. It's the loss of his faculties. It's the fear of becoming the burden they had already labeled me as. In a moment of pure panic, my hand actually reached for the phone to call Clara, to tell her it was all a mistake, that I'd drop it, that they could have whatever they wanted if they would just stop. But as I looked at the phone, my eyes fell on the framed photo of Martha on the end table. She was looking right at me, her smile so full of strength and love. She would never have surrendered. She would have fought. I took a deep, shuddering breath and dialed Mr. Davies instead. My voice shook a little as I told him what was happening. The call from the doctor's office, the whispers from neighbors and relatives. Mr. Davies listened patiently until I was finished. His voice, when he finally spoke, was as calm and steady as ever. "I was anticipating this, Mr. Miller," he said, without a hint of surprise. "It's a common and dirty tactic. Do not worry. We are going to turn this around on them." He then proposed a bold, proactive plan. "They want to question your competency," he said, a sharp edge to his voice now. "Fine. We will give them an answer they cannot possibly dispute." He suggested that I voluntarily undergo a complete neuropsychological evaluation with an independent court-certified specialist. "Instead of letting them attack, we go on the offensive," Mr. Davies explained. "We will obtain an irrefutable medical certification stating that you are of sound mind and full capacity. We will take their chosen weapon, and we will use it against them." Hearing his words, hearing the strategy, the fear inside me evaporated. It was replaced by something cold, hard, and absolute, a resolve of pure steel. "Book the appointment," I said. "I'll do it. I'll tell you what the scariest weapon in the world is. It isn't a fist or a gun. It's a whisper. A quiet whisper in the ear of a doctor, a neighbor, or a relative. A whisper that says, he's losing it. He's not all there anymore. They try to steal your credibility, your good name, the one thing you've spent an entire lifetime building, brick by honest brick. They try to make you and everyone around you question your own shadow. Have you ever had to fight that battle, the battle against whispers? Let me know in the comments below. We're in this together.